So our next talk tonight is Iain. I'll just unmute.
No, the host may not unmute me. Oh gosh, more pop-ups. Weird being on the other side.
Yeah. So I think last time Iain was on a Zoom with Silvio, Iain was introducing Silvio for ComfyCon, but now Iain's presenting. So Iain is a data scientist who has fallen into the cyber profession. He has previously worked as a cybersecurity research engineer and as a cyber threat intelligence technical lead for the Australian government. He is currently the cyber technical lead for Leidos Australia, leading cybersecurity projects across the organisation. And he's also the founder and organiser of ComfyCon. Tonight, he's going to talk to us about transitioning cybersecurity to a mission risk mindset, also known as why the new ISM is better. So a little bit of controversy in this talk. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Before we start off, whenever Iain talks about risk at the ISM,
oh, but sorry. Silvio, you know you love it.
All right, I think we'll let Iain do his talk now.
No, I'm not allowed to talk.
All right.
So hopefully you guys can see my screen. Can someone confirm they can see my screen?
Absolutely, yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to say a couple of things to start off with. One, as many blue team people are, I'm sure I'm very tired. It's been a very busy day, as I'm sure your day has also been. But in some ways, it's been a good day because the Australian government has just given me quite a good use case for the talk that I'm just about to give. The other thing I'll say is I'm not a GRC, governance, risk and compliance person by trade. I'm a technical person. So feel free to say that you don't agree with something. I'm always willing to hear. But essentially what my talk today is about is to talk about the new ISM, so the Information Security Manual for those who aren't aware, and what's changed with it. So to go into some content. So we'll start off with some definitions because we always need to make sure we're talking about the same thing. For those who aren't aware, we'll talk about what the Information Security Manual actually is, because I'm sure a lot of you who don't deal with federal government or state government aren't necessarily aware of it. What's changed with it, and why a risk management approach, which is sort of what I'm hinting at here, is a bit better than the previous approach, which is more of a compliance approach. And supporting that, I've got a nice little allegory. As discussed before, I don't think I need to go through all this, but yeah, I've done a lot of stuff, and I still do stuff. It's probably accurate. So for some definitions, for anyone who's been to one of my talks before, this slide will always be in it. We start off by talking what risk actually is. So risk is a measure of the extent to which an entity is threatened by a potential circumstance or event. So it's the potential for something bad to happen. And within cybersecurity, we talk about this as being a combination of threat and vulnerability. So threat is any circumstance or event with the potential to adversely impact organizational operations, assets, or individuals. These are definitions from the NIST standard. If anybody wants to see it, I'm more than happy to send it to them. But essentially, when we talk about threat, we generally talk about threat actors. So we talk about groups of people who are targeting a certain organization, a certain network, a certain system with a given intent. For vulnerability, we talk about a weakness. You know, that's pretty much a given one. I think the information security community has gotten vulnerability quite well down. It's the threat piece that needs some work, but hopefully I'll be highlighting where that comes in the next few slides. Some more definitions. So risk management. So we talked about what risk is, but risk management is using that risk to determine what actions to take based on a network. So in simple terms, what controls should I put in place on a network to defend the network? Now, obviously, we know that no network is unhackable, but we decide based on some methodology what controls to implement. And so risk management is a tool that you can use to decide what controls to implement. So the NIST risk management framework is a really good example. And as you'll find out, rather than invent the wheel, the Australians have taken that on board. A risk owner, someone who's accountable for a risk. So traditionally, this is your CISO, this is the system owner. These are both terms that are defined in the Information Security Manual as well. Every federal government agency is responsible for having a CISO, it's responsible for having an ITSA, and it's responsible for having system owners. And finally, accreditation. So for those who haven't worked in a federal space or a state government space, there is a process known as accreditation. And this is the process of achieving approval to use a network. It's not necessarily about just plugging everything in and making sure that everything will work. You actually have to go through a very structured process to assess the network, assess the security controls of the network to gain what is known as authority to operate. And then this one in here, which is quite relevant for today, when I talk about threat actor tiers, this is what I'm talking about. So this is a great slide that's from some Department of Defense, that's with an S in the US, which talks about the different types of threat actors. So we start from script kiddies, non-malicious actors on tier 1, and we go up to tier 6. And the way this diagram works is it shows you that as you go up the tiers, the resources increase, but the number of actors decreases. The right-hand side also talks about how threat actors, the defining characteristics. So tier 1, tier 2, they'll download something from the internet and use that. Tier 3, tier 4, they'll discover something that's a vulnerability in a system. And tier 5 and tier 6 will actually create vulnerabilities. And when I say full spectrum, they actually mean not just using cyber, but using espionage, physical effects. And when they're actually using cyber, we're also talking about kinetic effects, which is quite an interesting role that if anybody's interested in, I'd love to talk to them about. So a bit of a TLDR up front, because I know some people will want to know that. And I just want to make clear, so the new ISM allows resourced organizations to exercise mature risk management approaches to enable their business operations through careful selection of security controls. Couple of important points there. Resourced. So we talk about security operations teams, and one of the things that I hear in regards to taking on a risk management approach is we don't have enough people. Well, arguably you don't have enough people because you don't have enough people. It's not because you're using a risk management approach. It's that you don't have the right people in the right place to do the right thing. Maturity. There is an amount of making the model work for you, understanding your environment, understanding how you fit within a business process, the organization's business processes, and how they work around you. And then careful selection. It's not a matter of a checklist. And if I can get anybody to walk away from this is, if you use a checklist to say your network is secure, you are probably lying to yourself, or you're not actually getting a good security outcome. So what is the ISM? For those of you who work in, again, federal government, state government, potentially those who do business with them, you've probably seen this document and you've probably read it cover to cover. I know I have on a number of occasions. It's a great read. You should read through it. It's the Australian Government Information Security Manual made by ASD and the ACSC. Important thing to note there, it's the 19th of June 2020 right now, and this was updated in 2020 in June. So this is the latest version. Now, this is something that wasn't generally done previously. For those who are aware, the ISM was generally updated on a yearly or 6 monthly basis. So this is one of the changes. What does that actually contain? So it contains information on suggested controls for classified networks as well as DLM networks. For those who don't know what a DLM is, it's like a classification, but light kind of thing. It forms the basis to develop those security controls. So it provides you a giant list of controls that you can then pick from and pick and choose and say, I'm going to implement these controls on my network. So it's a good guide for you to be able to start developing the security around your network. Now, the important thing is, as I noticed somebody's mentioned in the Slack, and I'll get to later, it doesn't contain every single control. It's a list of controls that have been evaluated by ASD and ACSC. It's not the be all and end all. You always have that option to actually talk about, to introduce other controls later on. And you go through this process with the documentation, and then you're assessed for accreditation by a member of what's called the IRAP program. So there's a whole list of IRAP assessors. If you've gone through this process, you know what it is, but essentially they'll come in, they'll understand your system and the controls you've put in place and say, yep, this is probably okay, send it off to the next person. And so the next person is actually the accreditation authority / the risk owner for the organization. Oh, everyone's joining CSides. The accreditation authority risk owner of the organization is generally the CISO, but basically that is where the buck stops. That is the person who has accountability that if something goes wrong on that network, they are the person who has to accept the risk that that will go wrong. Important point, and it's called out in the ISM, and I'm sure there's not many people who are affected by this, unless it's a top secret network. The risk is generally owned by someone within the organization. If it's a top secret network, it's owned by Director General ASD. It's an interesting fact if you ever work on top secret networks. It also contains the Essential 8. Topic of the day. The Essential 8 provides a baseline of controls. Now, the important thing is it's a baseline of controls based on what ASD and ACSC think are likely, right? ASD and ACSC may not know your environment. In fact, they probably don't. They have made a judgment call, a risk management call, that these are the controls that you should be implementing in your environment. The problem with this is it is only a reporting requirement for government agencies, as far as I'm aware, but at the moment it's become a pseudo compliance requirement. People are being held to account for the Essential 8. And as you'll see later on, sometimes the Essential 8 controls don't make sense within an environment. Sometimes you can have particular systems, particular ways of working that implementing the Essential 8 controls will actually cause a problem with your business processes. Arguably, it's also proven not to be working. This is an article that came out last week before from IT News, talking about top 18 government agencies. And if you can see the graph, there's a very distinct lack of agencies compliant to those controls. This is why I think we need a different way of looking at things. And unfortunately, compliance is not really the answer. We need to start looking at these systems individually as they should be, and start applying security controls that make sense for them. And in my opinion, that's what ASD and ACSC did. So what changed? Well, very simply, here's an old version of the ACSC, the ISM. So it says this document is not a compliance-based standard, and it says you need to pick your own risk management framework, which is great. Now, it then also lists underneath, these are the controls. So for example, on an official protected secret or top secret network, you should, for those who've studied systems engineering, should is not a requirement. It is a, you can do this. A HIPS is implemented on workstations. Now, another control says 1034, official protected secret, top secret networks, you must. Must means, as Alan said in a call we had the other week, must means you absolutely have to do this. So a HIPS is implemented on high-value servers such as authentication servers, domain name servers, web servers, blah, blah, blah. Now, there's a slight contradiction here. It says it's not a compliance-based standard, but there are things you need to comply with, okay? I'm sure this has been commented on a number of times, and in my opinion, this is one of the reasons why this has changed. But realistically, you say you're not a compliance-based standard, but you are a compliance-based standard. You must do these things. So what did they do? So this is November 2019. So this is, let's have a look, 8 months ago, or an eternity if you consider the way this year has gone. This is what they've changed to. So using a risk management framework. So the difference here is they've actually given you a risk management framework to use. They've given you they're not giving you a choice in it, which is arguably a good thing. It means you don't have to sort of wonder which one to use. And they've chosen RMF, which is a risk management framework that has been established by NIST in the US, so the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US. It has 6 steps. You define the system, you select the security controls, you implement them, you assess them, you authorize the system, and you keep going. And then you monitor the system, and then it loops round and it goes round. And so they've defined this to make it easier to get into risk management. But the other change they've made is they've removed the shoulds and musts. So a HIPS is implemented on workstations, no longer a should. A HIPS is implemented on high-value servers, such as authentication servers, domain name servers, etc., no longer a must. So the question that gets asked, does that mean you can now ignore the ISM? No. Doesn't mean you can ignore the ISM. The ISM, the way that it's now structured, means that there is an understanding from ASD, ACSC that system owners are the only people who can adequately identify the risks, and as we discussed before, that is dependent on your threats and your vulnerabilities that your system has, and to therefore implement the controls to defend those risks or to mitigate those risks. So rather than a blanket approach to security, it puts the onus on government agencies to identify what is relevant to them. And as a bonus to the organizations, it allows you to choose the controls that make sense for your organization based on those risks and threats. That's the important point. It doesn't mean you can just choose the easy ones. It means you choose the ones that are relevant and not use the controls that are either too onerous or disable business. Because the important thing, as I'll say later on, we as a group of people within an organization, federal government, state government, what have you, need to make sure that we're enabling the business in a secure fashion. So why is this better? Risk management is the language of executives. So risk is not a cyber only thing. It applies to all of these things on this screen. We talk about business risk, we talk about financial risk, we talk about safety, protection, control, strategy, analysis, and of course cyber with the wonderful font. Risk is something that leaders understand, and even if you are doing a compliance approach, I would strongly suggest that you understand how risk works and how you can engage with risk to be able to provide that back to your managers. But in this case, because you're using a risk management approach, managers and leaders understand what you're talking about. You're engaging with risk. And that's an important thing. Risk is not a bad thing. We engage with risk all the time. This is about constructively engaging with risk. And as I promised, here is my fun allegory to also highlight some more points. So for those who are of a Royal Air Force or RAAF or what have you bent, this is the F-104 Starfighter. So this aircraft was designed by Kelly Johnson, who, if you don't know, was the gentleman who invented the Skunk Works at Lockheed Martin, that amazing place that all the aircraft engineers want to go to. So it was invented in the 60s and 70s as a replacement to some of the aging aircraft that was within the US military after World War II. It was designed to be what they call a fair weather fighter, which means that it can basically take off during a normal day. It can then land under a normal day. If it was raining or if it was stormy, it's probably less of a, not as able to do it. And the story goes that the German Air Force, the West German Air Force specifically, were looking to rebuild their Luftwaffe during the 60s and 70s after it had been obviously decimated during World War II. And they were looking for a new aircraft. And the story is told through this, it's an album actually by a gentleman called Robert Calvert, who was in a band called Hawkwind during the 70s. But the story goes like this. The salesman says, yes, it's a fair weather fighter. You won't find anything better. And the Germans say, yes, but that's great. But we want bombing, strafing, assault, battery, interception, ground support, reconnaissance. We want this thing to do everything, basically. And the salesman goes, yep, that's fine. We'll just make some modifications. Nothing could possibly go wrong. And they ended up with the F-104G, G for Germany, as they say in the album. There was one slight problem. The F-104G had the highest fatality rate of any modern aircraft. So the F-104 in particular did not exactly have a great record. I'll say that now. But the F-104G had an even worse record. And that's partly down to the fact that they tried to build too much into the aircraft at once. The aircraft couldn't handle dealing with all the equipment, all the different features, and basically was quite difficult to fly, and also, it just would randomly crash. The German Air Force and the pilots of the German Air Force used to call it the Widowmaker. And so this allegory, for me, teaches a couple of different things. So systems should and cannot be designed to counter every threat imaginable without impacting usability. So this aircraft was designed to counter any sort of threat. It was designed to counter air. It was designed to counter land. It was designed to do everything. But the problem was you ended up with an unusable system. And this goes to the story we often tell a lot, which is the most secure system is a system that's turned off, disconnected from the internet, and thrown into a river. You know, it's the most secure system, but it's also not actually a usable system. A follow-on from that is cybersecurity is there to enable a business to do its work securely, not to inhibit it. So the point of cybersecurity is the business needs to function. We are only here at the whim of the business. The business needs to do what it does. We need to secure the business. That means whatever we do, we need to make sure that the business is secure. And so linking back to my original statement, a risk approach takes into account those relevant threats, i.e. it understands in the aircraft what particular things the aircraft needs to be designed to do, and not everything, but the very specific things. If the Germans are, at the time, had thought, well, we're actually going to be against tanks, therefore we need to target this thing, but we're not going to be against fighters, therefore we don't need this thing, they might have had a more successful aircraft. And the vulnerabilities as well. So less of mention in the aircraft analogy, but within a cyber analogy, you know, there's no point putting a WAF in if you don't have any web applications. Like, we know that, that's a given. Let's take that a step further. Let's understand specifically what vulnerabilities are on our systems and therefore put the controls in only to defend against those vulnerabilities, rather than putting controls in for the sake of putting controls in, which arguably, if we're being honest, can happen a lot if you just implement the Essential 8 or you use the old approach, the ISM. And in my opinion, this is a big one, mature risk management approaches provide better security outcomes and business outcomes. So how many times have we been, you know, you might have put in a request, I want to use a piece of software, and the automatic response back is no, no, because of some reason, because of, oh, it's not on our list or what have you. Mature risk management strategies allow you to look at that application and understand what it actually does. What is it within the context of your environment? How can it affect you? It's really important to, the problem I find with people who say you can't actually do this in real life is not that the risk management piece is difficult, but it's understanding your network that's difficult. Arguably, that's something we need to do anyway. We always need to understand what our network is, because otherwise, how do we defend it? And again, my argument there is, well, obviously the current approach isn't working, where we kind of know what's on our network and we just chuck controls in for the sake of it. Let's try this new one. Thank you, IT Girl, for also pointing out this risk management is also a process that keeps going on and on and on. It's meant to be this thing where, you know, threat changes on a daily basis. Your threat can change from one day to another. Today is a great example of that. Today, Linda Reynolds and Scott Morrison stood up and said, there are threat actors targeting Australia. You should use these two controls. Now, for those who have been listening to this presentation and know me, that's an important breakthrough for the government. They didn't say implement the Essential 8. They said implement these two specific controls. They said these two controls out of the Essential 8, they're Essential 8 controls, it doesn't matter. They're Essential 8 controls that were told to be implemented to defend this threat. That is exactly what this approach will give you at the end. This approach will tell you this threat can be defeated by these controls. Implement these controls because this threat is relevant to you. In essence, oh no, the right security control in the wrong place for a threat actor can make all the difference in the world. It's not about just putting up controls everywhere. Obviously, we can't do this. Like, we don't have enough money. We don't have enough resources. So pick your controls carefully and make sure that you understand your network and you understand your threats. A few examples, I wanted to include these because some people, you know, tell me that, oh, we've implemented application whitelisting across our entire environment. And I'll be brutally honest, you haven't. It's not possible. If someone has a proper application whitelisting system across their environment without weird exceptions, like you can run apps from this folder or you can run apps from this folder, I'll buy you a beer. Like, I'm happy to be proven wrong, but most organizations do not have that level of control. And so some really good examples here. The ISM says you must patch within 48 hours, which a lot of people complained about today for operating systems. For those who work with industrial control systems, you do not patch industrial control systems within 48 hours. That is a no-no. You will break the system if you don't do testing. Application whitelisting for software developers. Again, I've never seen a solution that actually works well for software developers. Again, the only solution that I've generally ever seen is you either give the software developers the ability to sign themselves, in which case that kind of defeats the point of having signing, or you whitelist a folder, in which case, again, that defeats the point of application whitelisting. Macros for finance personnel. I know of a number of different organizations that if you disabled macros in them, the entire organization would stop. That's the business process they've built. So you find other controls to defend against those things. AV, if you're a penetration tester. I'm sure if you're a red teamer, you've disabled AV on your system, therefore you are not compliant with that control. Like, that's the way it is. So I've talked about where things are at now with the ISM. A couple of tips just to sort of help people who may be at that point, but also need to be to what is the next step after this. So risk, as I said earlier, is not this single thing. Risk is a concept applied to business, is applied to finance, and so why do we treat cyber risk differently? Cyber risk is just another part of risk within an organization. So realistically, you should end up with this integrated risk management model. The impacts of risk are calculated in the risk. Therefore, you can compare a cyber risk versus a financial risk because they both have an impact on the business. We shouldn't be treating them separately. A great way of looking at this, if you have worked in a military context or you have the ability to see some sort of military doctrine, is looking at military risk management models and mission risk, which is what I talked about at the beginning. Mission risk is understanding all the risks to my operation within a given area of operations. They could be cyber risks, they could be shooting risks, they could be health risks, they could be, I don't have the logistics in this place. It's about transitioning to that point where you understand what will stop you doing your mission, what will stop you from achieving your goals at a bigger picture level rather than focusing down on the lower level, because arguably cyber might not actually be the most important thing for you to consider. And that's it. I know this has probably rubbed a few people the wrong way, and I am somewhat apologetic, but I'm not entirely apologetic. I am one of those people, I'm a techie. I know that we should implement controls, but I think the best option for the user is this sort of model moving forward. So thank you very much for listening. And I know there's a few questions which I am trying to work out the answers to in the comments.
I've copied down some of the questions. There are a ton of questions. I think this
oh God, what have I done this time?
a good long question time for you. Maybe you can watch the Slack because I'm pretty sure as you answer
I am watching the Slack. I was watching it at the time, which is why I was calling out people. I can see you. I can multitask.
Yeah. Okay. So as I ask the questions, if people generate more questions from your answers,
yeah.
Because I think I missed a question with Eleanor, but the first question came from Dave right at the start of your talk.
Sure.
He said, so how do we assess hardening options that are not mentioned in the ISM?
Good question. So this is a problem. This is an interesting one because so obviously, not that I'm going to go on about it, but obviously I work in a vendor space, right? And so the moment you mention a control that's not in the ISM, I know there are some customers that go, it's not in the ISM, we don't care. So how do you actually prove the value? And realistically, it goes back to that risk management approach. So if you can demonstrate the value of how your technology or this hardening option defends against a given threat, and the organization agrees that that's a relevant threat to their systems, then you should be good. The problem I think in that space is not necessarily how do you demonstrate it, it's how do you actually get to that conversation where you're having a risk management approach conversation in the first place. Now, one of the things that came out of this ISM, and I was having lots of discussions at the time when this happened and the CCSL changes came out as well, was, it's probably not a great move for small organizations and small government at the moment because they're not really at this level. The longer term picture is this will help to bring in those controls, to understand how those controls to impact your systems.
So the next question was from Craig Small. He said, how does the new ISM help implementers in a project Before, if my widget had a desktop and a name server, I knew the former didn't really need it and the latter did. I have a definite goal now. What's my target? Who decides?
So realistically, again, this comes down to my statement about resourcing. So organizations generally have some form of vulnerability assessment team. So they'll run Nessus on the system. So you understand the vulnerabilities on the organization. The corollary to that is you need to actually have some kind of threat team. So you need to understand the threats to the organization, the threats to the systems. So realistically, in my opinion, again, you would go talk to your threat team. You would say, okay, I'm building this system. It's going to have these components. It's going to have this way of working. Who are the likely threats that are going to target that system if they have access to it? Also, what data is stored in it? Because that's the important thing, is it's always about the outcome. And they should be able to come back to you and say, it's this threat or it's this threat, and these are the controls you should put in place. Now, I understand that most people don't have the resources for that. So realistically, in those circumstances, you should try and do that research yourself. So understand what you're building, understand the context of the organization you're building it for, understand who's likely to target you, and therefore implement those controls based on that. There's a lot of open source intelligence information that allows you to, MITRE ATT&CK is a great example of something that nowadays has there's a database on the MITRE ATT&CK webpage, tells you about all the threat actors they can think of, and then it tells you about all the techniques they use, and therefore it tells you how to defend against those techniques. So you find out who's relevant to you, you find the techniques, you build the controls to defeat the techniques.
I'm just mesmerized by all your Discord chat, by the way.
Oh God, why is my Discord?
Yeah, it's your Discord.
Oh no.
That's all right. Behave. I think Benzies gave you 10 out of 10 for your talk, so that's a good thing.
Still screen sharing, just so
that's fine.
We can actually maybe I'll turn that off. I think Sylvia's going to ask a question on Oversight.
I did. Mate Mellis asked this question. I sort of have my own sort of thing to add to this as well, but mind you, I'm not really that familiar with this world. If you have a department or an organization that maybe doesn't take security as importantly as other organizations, how do you ensure sort of quality? How can you have oversight that they are implementing, controls and mitigations, appropriate? Like previously, to just say, well, your network's not accredited because it's clearly failing these compliance requirements.
Yeah, but even then, they would still run because you would find some again, this is speaking from experience, there would be an operational reason why the network had to continue or something else, and arguably the only way is to hold people to account for these things. I was listening to a presentation by a vendor the other week, and they talked about the Target breach in 2013. And the important thing about the Target breach was it was the first time that a CEO got fired because of a breach. And I think there's a lesson in there, which is breaches are inevitable, yes, but if you don't do everything you can to stop a breach, then you should be held accountable. Ultimately, until we see that accountability being held against people, nothing's really going to change. Now, there is the corollary. I keep saying that word, but I can't say it. There is the opposite to that, which is you did everything you could and you still got hacked. Well, that should be evidence through what you did. That should be evidence through a clear chain of understanding of, yep, we found these threats, we know these risks, we did everything we could, and something came out of nowhere. So you have the paper-based evidence to join that. And as I said, until accountability comes in for these things, it's not going to change. It doesn't matter whether you have a compliance-based approach where you say you must implement the Essential 8, because it doesn't work. Like, we've seen the charts, we know the ANA reports. They keep coming out and they're saying, you're not compliant, and people just shrug.
There was one more question from Maybe. He was asking, do you think there's a scalability problem for expertise in this space? So with the new ISM, there's going to be more expertise needed to assess those risks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, hell yes. That's kind of a given. Let's be honest. I'm very much of the opinion we need to sort of stop lying to ourselves about some of these things. Our SOCs and security teams are not resourced the way they should be. Arguably, we should have been doing things like vulnerability assessments, threat intel before the ISM changed. However, with the ISM changes, it's just made it even more relevant. Realistically, it's put the onus back on, it's almost provided a carrot and a stick for these government organizations. The carrot being, okay, you can choose your own controls now. Awesome. The stick is you need to make sure you don't get hacked, and you need to take the role of being the person who understands your systems. Maybe that will work. This approach has only been in for 6 months, and I'm seeing some changes, but I won't say, this is why I said at the beginning, there's a resourcing problem. So, sorry, you need to be well resourced. The argument is we don't have enough people. Well, the argument is we don't have enough people because we don't have enough people. It's not because we're not doing a risk management approach, we're doing a compliance approach. It doesn't matter. We still need more people. We still need to fix that problem, which is why we do things like CSides, which is why we do all these things, to bring people on, to try and get them interested, to get them in the career.
Yeah. He sort of followed up with, and should some system along the lines of SSL lab test be constructed by maybe ASD or ACSC to help system implementers self-assess rather than, you don't think so?
No, because that's compliance.
Yep. Okay. Exactly.
Some tool is not going to understand the specifics of your environment. It's not going to understand that you haven't implemented a control for a given reason. I don't like, as a non-binding thing potentially, but like to actually ensure that you're getting good security outcomes, it's got to be driven by humans. Unfortunately, that's, we have that problem and we have the resourcing problem. Well, we have both, but we kind of have to deal with it at this point.
Yep. Okay, great. I think maybe he's typing. I don't know if he's commenting on that, but maybe you could.
I'm waiting. Alan, do you have any questions? I'm waiting for Alan's questions.
Maybe you could jump into the Slack.
Yeah, I'll be in there.
I think they all want to talk a little bit more about that with you.
Yeah,
he did say good insight. Thanks. So there you go. You've convinced him. Great. All right. Thanks again, Iain. It was great to hear from you.
No worries. Thank you very much, guys.
See ya.
Great. Which brings us to our final talk. I did get told